Here are the top 10 lessons I learned from my first year growing in a high tunnel here in Texas. Let's go. Hey friends, it's Kendall, your joyful farmer. This was our first year growing in this 20-foot by 40-foot greenhouse with high sidewalls from growerssolution. Let's get right into the top 10 things I've learned this year. Number 1, insect netting has some definite benefits. It's an amazing physical barrier that will deter grasshoppers, cucumber beetles, and other insects. My dahlias, zinnias, and snapdragons had much nicer petals this year because of the absence of those pesky little bugs, and my bush beans, which would typically be destroyed quickly by grasshoppers, were beautifully green and productive. My cucumbers were also disease-free because the cucumber beetles weren't in here infecting the foliage. Insect netting is installed along the 2 long walls as well as the door opening to allow for air to circulate. The plastic walls of the high tunnel roll up and down and can be sealed as needed. Number 2, insect netting has some drawbacks. It blocks out some of the damaging bug populations, but it also blocks out natural predators of the damaging bugs like birds, predatory wasps, and assassin bugs. This means that the insect populations that are present in the greenhouse can really become problematic. We've had noticeable issues with moths, spider mites, and also aphids. Next year, I'll be working on our use of natural predators of these particular species. I did do an application of lacewing eggs this year, but it was early in June, so it was way too hot at that time for the eggs to develop. But next year, I'll be sure to start earlier with those beneficials, and I also may try utilizing traps for moths that have effective pheromone lures in them. Number 3, it gets hot in here. When the tunnel is completely closed in with plastic, it heats up very quickly anytime the sun is out. Whether the temperature is freezing or hot outside, it doesn't really matter. That's not super surprising, as that's how the greenhouse effect works, right? Even over the winter, on a day where there are freezing temperatures, the high tunnel can actually reach 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 38 degrees Celsius. Ventilation and fans are necessary in here for air circulation and to also push the hot air out, especially when it's sealed up. Number 4, soil temperature stays relatively warm in here year round. I keep a little soil thermometer popped into the soil to make sure that I can check the soil temperature. It warms up really quickly in early spring. The soil was 65 degrees Fahrenheit or about 18 degrees Celsius in the high tunnel soil in early March of this year. That allowed us to get a really big head start on plants by direct sowing in early March, and our April looked more like a typical late May, early June that we would have outside in the field. This year, it put us about 6 weeks ahead on flower production and produce. Number 5, shade cloth. Shade cloth will absolutely save your plants in summertime in a high tunnel in Texas. We installed the shade cloth on May 18th of this year. In general, shade cloth is super helpful anyway, just to extend the production of plants into the hot Texas summer. But the cucumber plants in the high tunnel in May were starting to get droopy from the heat and the Texas sun. But we found that an hour after we installed the shade cloth, the temperature inside the high tunnel had dropped 10 degrees and the cucumber foliage had perked right back up. Number 6, fans and ventilation. They are an absolute must if you want to have a chance at growing throughout the summer. After our last frost passed in early April, we rolled up the plastic sidewalls, leaving only insect netting on the long walls and the roll-up door. That's a 7-foot by 7-foot door opening. Even with the sidewalls rolled up and the 50% shade cloth, the temperature in here stayed fairly high in the summertime. It would reach 112 degrees Fahrenheit or about 45 degrees Celsius in the heat of the day before we installed the fans and ventilation. But we finally installed the fans and the temperature dropped another 10 degrees Fahrenheit. One of the reasons for the retention of so much heat in here is the insect netting serves as a wind block. Had we taken down the insect netting, it would have made the temperature much cooler in here through the summer months. But I also didn't want the grasshoppers and cucumber beetles in here, so it was a trade-off. And to me, to keep those guys out, it was worth it. Number 7, water needs during the summer are high. I could have watered twice per day in here and the soil still would have wanted more. I have 2 walking hoses that worked really well. They're retractable and they go down either walking path. But watering by hand took me an hour or so if I wanted to actually water deeply. And water during the summer is expensive. So I made a decision to let the soil go hydrophobic, and it was hard to help it recover from that. Mulching with 3 to 4 inches of compost or aged horse manure bedding helped a great deal with water retention, and I really wish I had done it much earlier in the summer season. Number 8, intensive spacing for plants. I wanted to really maximize the growing space in here, so the paths that we created between the beds are only 24 inches wide. You can really pack the plants into beds if the soil is well fed, and that helps also with shading the soil and the roots to keep them more cool in the summertime. Just know that pruning or thinning plants might be necessary to keep your walkways walkable. Also, if you're trying to save space in a greenhouse, growing vertically helps immensely. We ran cable across the trellises of each bed and then attached twine and dropped it down and stapled it into the soil below, creating these vertical trellises for cucumbers to climb and also to tie tomatoes to, and it worked great. Number 9. Season extension in the winter is pretty remarkable. The high tunnel gives a 5-degree buffer to the cold temperatures outside, and it also provides protection from the cold wind. So if temperatures drop below 27 degrees Fahrenheit or -2 degrees Celsius, I'll add some hoops and frost cloth to protect plants that need an extra layer of heat retention and protection. For us here in North Texas, that means that we have a great chance of growing a lot of varieties of veggies throughout the entire winter. Right now, my fall tomatoes over there are doing great. We still don't have a frost in the forecast and it is November, but as soon as the frost starts to hit outside, we'll start to roll the high tunnel walls down and hopefully get a little bit more production out of the tomatoes before winter really hits. Number 10, choose varieties wisely for a high tunnel. If you grow in a tunnel with no pollinators, you will need to know which vegetables don't require any pollination to produce, and those are the ones that you'll likely want to go with. Otherwise, you'll have to be hand pollinating plants in order to get a harvest. So for example, tomatoes will self-pollinate with wind, so I will sometimes brush the flowers as I walk past to increase the rate of pollination, but that's not totally necessary. Cucumbers and melons typically need pollinators, but I grew a couple of very productive varieties that are parthenocarpic called Excelsior and Gershwin. They got 0 pollination this year, but they produced a ton of cucumbers. I also grew a zucchini called Adunja zucchini, which claimed that it needed very little pollination to produce, but it did require hand pollinating to make zucchinis, and sometimes the shape of them was a little bit funky because the pollination wasn't as thorough as I guess the pollinators would have done. And of course, there are plenty of vegetables you can grow that don't need pollination to get a great harvest at all. Some that are like this are root vegetables, so carrots, beets, rutabaga, radishes, potatoes, leafy greens like lettuce or kale or collards, and alliums, so leeks, onions, and garlic. So those are 10 big things I learned growing in a high tunnel in Texas this year. If you have questions for me, I'd love if you'd comment below, or if you have tips or advice to share to other people who are trying to grow in a greenhouse or a high tunnel, I'd love if you'd share that as well. I hope it's helpful for you, and I wish you joy. I'll see you next time.